Zizek does what can be, in the vernacular, described as totally missing the point in his description of Heidegger's, what he's calling the Geworfenheit in terms of a horizon of understanding. Basically, the image is, if I'm going to a destination, I set myself to go to that destination. Something in what I'm already doing is led by this directing. This directing force, which is involved in something we've not yet reached, is nonetheless a current reality or present. If we call one side, the directing part, the representation, it's in Hegel, and then we call the other part the reality, then both are not, in Hegelian thought, considered as a representation. So in other words, you don't step back and see that the distinction between Geist and the reality of gravity must appear as a presence and also as representation or directing. So that the question you're asking remains here metaphysical or ontic. Because what Heidegger is trying to do is, in his ontological difference, is to do the kind of what Nietzsche says when Nietzsche says that the discovery that there is no most perfect political order, let's say, no true political order, rather than the, as the founders say, the attempt to make the more perfect, comparative, more perfect order. The order is already perfect, it's already complete. This is, by the way, the sense of good that Heidegger is pointing to. Something that's complete for the Greeks is agathon, is good. Beyond that, there's a sense they observe, just as the founders do, not so great, at not such a great distance from us, that there could be also a more, comparatively more perfect thing, which is already complete. And then in the ancient languages, they also have a superlative form of the word perfect, perfectimissimo, or something like that. This sense of the good, which is in a way modest and direct, when Zizek switches off and uses some example more like Heidegger's example that good for the Greeks meant the soundness of a ski board. It's flexibility, but taut strength. He simply distorts what Heidegger is saying. Heidegger is only showing, one, this is the source of our idea of good before it becomes moral good as a quality of the most perfect God in the Catholic thinking, as on this notion of Thomas's analogy of the good, so that we can, by good things, we see something which is properly escapes St. Paul's saying that there's an unapproachable light, something we can't quite get to, or the 30th thesis in Luther where he says nobody can know if they are genuinely contrite. In other words, there's some element of grace, something that's out of the normal rung, the messianic hint, like that, the horse winning at the at the good in the Politeia, the scent of it. Or no, sorry, that's not in the Politeia. That's in the another of Plato's dialogues on the. Sorry, but this good, which then becomes the moral good in the light of following this direction, which is only, let's say, the direction of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle develops it, and so on, but not of the Greeks properly. That would be absurd to say that. But only something that becomes more and more a direction, more and more a representation in Hegelian terms, which is marched towards, then becomes this so-called moral good, and then I think it's some of Zizek's worst kind of going into this of the whole, the mythos of the Holocaust, rather than the final solution, rather than stating it plainly, which is a kind of propaganda. I think isn't it so that more Russians died during that period than did Jews? And in any case, many people died of many groups. It's true that the manner and the understanding of how it happened makes it different, because they're not all combat related. But again, that's where we get into this issue of what is morality based on how we make an interpretation, and then you can all kinds of manipulations are involved once we start thinking in this kind of which the moral, which atrocity is, to use Butler's phrase, Judith Butler's phrase, the grievable one, or which is the limit of the grievability. This goes way beyond simply this notion of the completeness, something that's sound, a ripe apple, not necessarily the ripest or the most ready apple, but just a ripe apple. We don't need to. Once you start getting into the comparative form of the perfect apple, in the old sense where perfect just means complete, then you can drift into this infinite sentimentality, as Zizek does here in his critique of Heidegger's use of the agathon, or the good, as something which could be said of the clasp of a shoe snapping into place, or the efficient planning of the death camps, as is the example he gives. So that's basically a distortion. So then also his superimposition of this tea kettle thing, which of course you can find anywhere, and find examples to plug in anywhere very neatly, is basically just sophistry. So you could twist anything to make it somehow make sense in that mold of thinking, just like he twists Heidegger to make Heidegger into Hegelian Heidegger, or into a sub-Nietzschean Heidegger that hasn't grasped the final difficulty, which anything that's a representation is everything, and then when you make this split, eventually you can't keep with this representation. You can't keep with this except by saying, here's this Dasein concept, but again, we're aware that we're becoming somnolent and slipping back into mere theoria when we do that, or we're constantly at risk of doing so. We have to keep it the so-called arrogance, opening before us. So, for instance, with this, I was thinking here of Simmel's version of the fact value distinction from about 1890, where he's finally puts the death knell in Dasein, or the Art of Kant, by pointing out that exactly by the same standard that Kant has done away with being, or the so-called copula in the sentences grammatical is, by saying this is only the copula in the sentence, so there's no point in going beyond the genus of substance, or the highest genus supremum. In that sense, you're merely doing something grammatical. You're not stating something about the subject matter of metaphysics, or the metaphysics of Kant, the critical metaphysics. So this form of being as taking a specific content with qualities like goodness, with this analogy on the good type of qualities and other things, is sloughed off, or outstripped. Here we have also this difficulty that Zizek, in giving his interpretation in the terms of these sort of moralizing, and then saying, this person has failed to with the Arendt stuff, like this person has failed to come up with any real answers to these problems, and so on and so forth, simply slips away from the basic sense of the thinking here, which is that it's necessary we have to have something which could have been called a representation, and at the same time we have this awareness of the whole opening of the difficulty, which sets us out in these Nietzschean nihilism. Nihilism is setting contradistinction to pessimism. That's a good way to give it an exactitude. So not Schopenhauer and what got called pessimism, but nihilism. Nihilism is Platonic tact as a perfect view, but it's open, in other words, perfect in the sense that it says this is the reality of the situation. Yes, maybe it could improve to some extent, but this is the complete political order as best we can now do. Something like that, like what I just said, the perfect union and the more perfect union, and then the vague sense that there could be a most perfect union. This view of politics is a more like what Arendt and Heidegger are moving in. So Zizek is bringing in kind of these weird potshots to alien moralistic concerns, especially this kind of Levinas, semi-mystical but also semi-puritanical somehow views, which are held in reverence in certain blocks of the academy, let's say, especially this critical theory type of and continental philosophy type of blocks, passivity beyond passivity, and people that read Walter Benjamin and all that other stuff. We have one clear mistaken tact, in my view, in the missing of the Straussian view. So Strauss was in Germany at the time, of course. And he says that, although he wasn't reading Heidegger for a long period of time, but he knew it was a close role, and he was mixed into the, aside from that, he knew the situation in the university where Heidegger had become the chancellor in Heidelberg in 1933, I think. So what he says is go to the Sophist book, the dedication to Paul Natorp, and this is Heidegger is basically a pacifist. So this is basically what Heidegger was hoping to present, which is this picture that there must be an awareness of Dasein such that one became aware of the problem of that there must be a tact or direction, and that this is what Heidegger's calling the inner responsibility has to be understood by the younger generation to take this responsibility. And the situation at the time of the rise of the Nazis was basically there was a lot of political parties, and it was because of the French had imposed this ultra-liberal Weimar Constitution, and then it included this notion of the equal representation voting scheme, so that which reduces any bloc which is large enough to have one representative will get one representative in the political party body in the parliament or whatever. So like, under our conditions in this country, you get only two choices, but everybody who voted in the election who was enough to be to have one representative, something like that. If you're like the Green Party or whatever, you'd have several, or the Nader Party, or the Tucker Carlson Party, or whatever it may be, Jordan Peterson Party. If they had enough, he's a Canadian, but he probably has a lot of backers here in the States, and actually even as a Canadian he could, I think he could be not president, but he could run for some high offices if you were so inclined. But in any case, under those schemes, anyone who has a big enough backing gets some representative. So that's it creates a sort of super pluralism where there's no direction. So for Heidegger, when the Nazi Party comes into power, that's quite a few people were relieved simply because even if it's order of the crudest kind, which was put in, it was better than the wallowing and floating around in the doldrums and all the constant bickering of a system where you have so many people who present themselves as pompously and arrogantly as regarding everyone else as a traitor for having a different view, but not just two parties, but 100 parties, 150 parties. So that's also, I think, plays a big role in why Heidegger engaged with this first chance to slough off the French-imposed Weimar Republic situation, which had so deliberately imposed vengeance on the defeated foe, the enemy throughout the ages, the enemy of the French, the Prussian state now become a sort of a feminized state, which was universally condemned among German thinking people. So that Zizek doesn't even mention, and doesn't seem to have any care to mention. Instead, he mentions, superimposes some of his notions very cavalierly over the material, and then makes a few comments that are interesting about the, that Heidegger, if he didn't have this mystique among a certain people who misread him so violently, wouldn't be as important. And then one thinks sort of vaguely about Gadamer's comics that yes, we shouldn't. We'd be doing a disjustice to Heidegger by regarding him as above politics, simply a philosophy scholar who was too abstracted to pay attention to the issues of daily existence.